A girl from a wealthy family chose not money, but a poor man with a young daughter. She thought she had lost everything, but an unexpected turn of events awaited her. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The Bennett estate glowed with the aura of wealth and permanence, a place where chandeliers had never gone dark, and the sound of servants' footsteps filled the halls like a muted orchestra. In the center of this carefully guarded world lived Evelina, the only daughter of Mr. Richard Bennett, one of the city's most powerful industrialists, and his wife Margaret, whose name adorned boutiques across the state. Evelina had just returned from university, fresh-faced, poised, and carrying the gentle pride of being a daughter everyone expected to marry into a legacy equal to her family's. Her father looked at her as an investment of his life's work, a bond to be traded for alliances. Her mother admired her like a jewel meant to complete the right setting. Evelina herself, however, quietly longed for something her parents could not calculate on their ledgers, a life that felt true. It was during a charitable excursion to the countryside that Evelina first encountered the man who would set her carefully scripted future ablaze. The day had been hot, the kind of heat that makes dust cling to shoes and presses sweat to skin. Evelina had accompanied her mother's philanthropic committee to deliver school supplies and clothing to a rural village. Her presence there had drawn whispers. The sight of a young woman in a tailored summer dress stepping onto a cracked dirt road was as startling as a swan appearing in a chicken yard. She carried herself with grace, but her eyes wandered restlessly as though searching for something she had never known to name. She saw him near the edge of a field, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his back taut as he lifted a wooden beam to mend a fence. His movements were steady, purposeful, each gesture carrying the rhythm of someone used to labor. Beside him, a small girl of about 6 clutched a battered book, her hair tied in 2 uneven braids. She watched her father with admiration, occasionally calling out in a voice filled with laughter. Evelina paused, compelled to linger, her curiosity catching like a thread on a nail. The villagers spoke softly, almost reverently, about the man named Mark. He was 40, a widower, raising his little daughter Lila alone after his wife's passing years earlier. His farm was modest, only a few cows, a stretch of land that gave just enough to survive. Yet there was something in the way he wiped sweat from his brow, in the tender glance he cast toward his daughter, that made him seem richer than many of the men Evelina had been introduced to in gleaming ballrooms. She caught Lila's gaze and offered a smile. The child smiled back, shy but curious, clutching her book a little tighter. In the days that followed, Evelina found reasons to return to the village. Officially, she brought more supplies or oversaw small charitable projects. Unofficially, her eyes searched for the weathered man and his bright-eyed daughter. She began to sit with Lila beneath the shade of an old oak, reading stories aloud, helping her trace words with a finger. Lila, cautious at first, gradually leaned closer, her laughter spilling freely. Evelina brought paints and brushes, and the girl's delight at mixing colors on rough paper filled the air with a kind of joy Evelina had never known inside her father's marble halls. Mark remained courteous but reserved. He thanked her with a nod, sometimes with words, but always with the quiet distance of a man aware of boundaries. He knew what she represented, what world she belonged to, and he refused to presume. Still, Evelina noticed the way his expression softened when he watched her with Lila, the way his voice gentled in her presence. There was no performance in him, no need to impress. He worked with his hands, loved his daughter fiercely, and lived each day with a dignity that no wealth could buy. The pull grew stronger each time Evelina visited. At night, back in her lavish bedroom, she replayed the images in her mind. Mark kneeling to tie Lila's shoelaces, Mark lifting a bucket of water, Mark smiling faintly when the girl hugged him. She compared it to the sterile smiles of young heirs her parents paraded before her, men who spoke of profit margins and luxury cars, but never of love or sacrifice. She began to realize that the life chosen for her was not the one her heart craved. The moment of truth arrived one evening in the Bennett mansion. The living room was aglow with golden lamplight, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and Margaret's perfume. Evelina summoned her parents, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "There is someone I want you to meet," she began. someone I love. His name is Mark. He is a farmer. He is 40, a widower, and he raises his daughter alone." The silence that followed was like glass shattering. Her mother's eyes widened with shock. Her father's face darkened with fury. Richard Bennett rose from his leather chair, towering over her. "A farmer? An old man with a child? Evelina, this is an insult to everything we have built. You would throw away your future for such a man?" Margaret's voice wavered with disbelief. "Darling, you are young, beautiful, with every opportunity before you. Do you want to waste it all living in dirt, tied to cows and fields? Think of the life you deserve." But Evelina did not waver. She felt the strength of Mark's quiet dignity within her, the innocence of Lila's trust. "I don't want riches without happiness," she said softly but firmly. "I have seen more love in their small house than in all the mansions I have ever visited. I choose him." Her father's face grew red, his voice sharp enough to cut. "If you walk this path, you are no longer my daughter. You will leave this house with nothing. Do you understand?" Margaret gasped, clutching her husband's arm. "Richard, please, she's our only child." But Richard's pride was a wall no plea could breach. "Better no child than one who disgraces our name." Tears welled in Evelina's eyes, but they did not fall. She lifted her chin, meeting her father's glare with calm resolve. "Then so be it. I will not marry for money. I will not live in a golden cage. I choose love, even if it costs me everything." That night, Evelina packed a small suitcase. Her heart pounded with fear, but her spirit burned with determination. She walked through the grand halls one last time, past the portraits of stern ancestors, past the marble staircases and the glittering chandeliers. At the gates, the air was cooler, freer. Beyond those gates waited the unknown, but also the man who had taught her that true wealth lay in love and honesty. The next morning she stood before Mark's humble home. Lila ran to her, clutching her book, her eyes wide with joy. Mark stepped out, confusion etched on his face as he saw the suitcase in Evelina's hand. "What are you doing here?" he asked quietly. "I've made my choice," she replied. "If you'll have me, I want to share your life." Mark hesitated, torn between hope and fear. But in that moment, with the rising sun casting gold across the fields and his daughter laughing at Evelina's side, he realized that fate had brought them something none of them had dared to imagine. Evelina had chosen, and her choice would change all their lives forever. And so began a journey not of ease, but of truth, a life where love would be tested against hardship, where pride and wealth would clash with simplicity and honor. Evelina stepped across the threshold of Mark's world, leaving behind everything she had known. She did not yet realize how heavy the trials ahead would be, nor how deep the bond between her, Mark, and little Lila would grow. But as she entered that small, worn house, her heart whispered that she was finally home. The first night Evelina spent under Mark's roof was unlike any other she had known. The wooden beams above her creaked softly in the wind, and the air smelled of earth and hay drifting in from the barn outside. The small bed she lay on had a coarse blanket, its fabric worn thin by years of use, and yet it felt more honest beneath her skin than the silk sheets she had abandoned in her father's mansion. She listened to the distant sound of cows shifting in their stalls, the occasional bark of a village dog, the chirp of crickets in the field. All her life she had been surrounded by polished floors, perfumed corridors, and muffled silence broken only by servants' steps. Now in this little house, every sound told her exactly where she was and who she had chosen to be. And though her heart trembled with uncertainty, she closed her eyes with a strange sense of peace. When the sun rose, Evelina awoke to the sight of a girl's face watching her from the doorway. Lila stood barefoot, her eyes curious and uncertain, clutching her small book to her chest. Evelina sat up, smiled softly, and beckoned her closer. The child hesitated, shifting from one foot to the other, as if measuring whether this stranger truly belonged in her world. Finally she approached, and Evelina smoothed her hair gently, saying good morning with warmth. Lila gave no reply but did not pull away. That, Evelina thought, was the first small step toward trust. Life in Mark's house was a rhythm of simplicity that Evelina had to learn quickly. The mornings began before the sun had climbed fully into the sky. Mark would already be outside milking the cows, while Evelina tried her hand at preparing breakfast over a wood stove that smoked more than it burned. She had never cooked a meal without the aid of skilled hands at her family's mansion, and more than once she burned bread or spilled porridge. But Mark never laughed, and Lila's giggles, though sometimes mischievous, softened the sting of her mistakes. Slowly, through clumsy effort and determination, she began to adapt. Her manicured hands, once used only for turning pages or holding teacups, now grew familiar with the weight of buckets and the roughness of soap-scrubbed laundry. The house was small, only 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, with walls that bore the cracks of years and a roof that leaked during heavy rains. Evelina folded her clothes into an old wooden chest, stacking them neatly beside Mark's worn work shirts and Lila's dresses patched at the elbows. There was no vanity table with polished mirrors here, only a wash basin and a shard of glass hung on the wall. Yet when Evelina looked into that imperfect mirror, she did not see a princess lost in squalor. She saw a woman who had chosen her path, even if it was lined with struggle. For Lila, however, Evelina's presence was not immediately welcome. The child loved her father with a fierce devotion, and the fear of losing his affection made her wary of anyone else who came too close. At times she would pout when Evelina sat near Mark, or refused to answer her questions, clinging instead to her father's arm. Evelina understood and did not force herself upon the child. Instead, she chose patience. She offered to help with lessons, to braid her hair, to read her stories at night. Slowly, Lila's guarded expression softened. There was a moment, weeks into Evelina's stay, when the girl fell asleep with her head resting on Evelina's lap, and Mark, watching from the doorway, understood that something had changed. Evelina was no longer an intruder in their fragile world. She was becoming part of it, yet the new life was not without pain. Evelina had traded wealth for hardship, and hardship revealed itself daily. The meals were plain, sometimes no more than bread and milk. Clothes were mended again and again until fabric grew too thin to hold a stitch. Money was scarce, and Mark stretched every coin until it bent. Evelina learned to swallow her pride when neighbors muttered as she passed. Some women shook their heads in disbelief, whispering loudly that the daughter of Richard Bennett had gone mad, choosing a farmer with cows over the suitors her parents had paraded. Children pointed at her in the market, repeating words they had overheard at home. Princess turned peasant, they called her. She endured it with a smile that cost her dearly. Alone at night, she sometimes pressed her face into the pillow and let the tears come. But every morning she rose and chose again. She reminded herself that she had not chosen ease but truth, not wealth but love. The sight of Mark's tired but grateful eyes and Lila's gradual trust gave her strength greater than gold. As weeks turned into months, Evelina began to share the weight of work more fully. She followed Mark into the fields, helping to guide the plow or gather hay. She learned how to milk the cows properly, her fingers aching at first but gradually finding the rhythm. Together they built a routine that was both grueling and satisfying. The house rang with laughter on good days, and on bad days, when exhaustion left them all in silence, there was at least the comfort of presence. Evelina discovered that happiness did not need chandeliers or silk curtains. It could live in the quiet of a shared meal, in the simple joy of a child's laughter, in the hand of a man steady beside her. But hardship was relentless. Rumors reached them that a local official sought to claim the small patch of land Mark farmed. The man, wealthy and ambitious, had long eyed the surrounding fields and wanted to expand his own holdings. Mark received a letter demanding proof of ownership and payment of overdue taxes he had never known he owed. His face grew grim as he read the words aloud, and Evelina saw the shadow of despair flicker across his expression. "I cannot fight them," he said bitterly one night, sitting by the small fire that barely warmed the room. "They will take what little we have. Men like me have no voice against men like him." Evelina touched his hand, her own fingers trembling but resolute. "You are not alone anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together. This home, this life, it is ours, and I will not let it be taken without a fight." Mark looked at her, astonishment mingled with gratitude in his weary eyes. He had expected her to regret, to flee back to the comfort of her father's mansion at the first sign of struggle. Instead, she spoke with a determination that matched the fire in her gaze. In that moment, he realized that her choice had not been a whim, but a vow. The threat of losing the land loomed over them like a storm cloud. Evelina could feel it pressing down, stealing away the lightness of their days. Yet even under that shadow, life continued. She and Lila grew closer, the girl finally slipping her hand into Evelina's without hesitation, calling her Mama in a voice so soft it nearly broke Evelina's heart. Mark worked longer hours, his body bent, but his spirit unwilling to collapse. Evelina stood beside him, her gowns long since replaced by simple dresses, her hair tied back with a ribbon Leila had given her. She no longer looked like the heiress of Richard Bennett, but like a woman forged by earth and love. The neighbors still whispered, but Evelina no longer cared. What mattered was the bond she had chosen, the life she was building with her own hands. What mattered was the man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, and the child who trusted her enough to sleep soundly in her arms. Yet beneath all this lay the knowledge that the world beyond their little farm had not forgotten them. Evelina's father still spoke her name with anger. Her mother still prayed for her return, and powerful men still believed that she had wasted her life. The letter about the land was only the first knock on the door of their fragile peace. More knocks would come, more trials would test the strength of their love and the resilience of their small family. As Evelina extinguished the lamp one evening and lay beside Lila, who had fallen asleep after whispering, "Good night, Mama," she felt Mark's gaze upon her from across the room. He said nothing, but the weight of his gratitude and fear pressed into the silence. Evelina closed her eyes, listening to the chorus of crickets outside, knowing that tomorrow would bring more battles. She did not yet know how severe they would become, nor how much they would demand of her. But she had chosen this path, and she would walk it to its end. The little house in the countryside stood fragile against the winds of change, but within its walls, Evelina had found something priceless. Love rooted itself here, between cracked beams and patched roofs, in the laughter of a child and the steadfast heart of a man. Yet even as she clung to this new reality, a shadow stretched toward them from the world of power and pride she had left behind. The storm was coming, and their quiet days would not last forever. The letter demanding land and taxes had not disappeared from Mark's table. Though weeks had passed since it first arrived, it lay there like a silent threat, its creased paper catching Evelina's eye every morning as she poured water into the basin or set bread on the table. Neither she nor Mark spoke of it often, yet both of them carried its weight in every word left unsaid. Life continued, because life must, but their laughter was thinner now, their smiles shadowed by worry. Evelina did her best to remain strong for Lila, who had grown more trusting, more attached, calling her mama without hesitation and clinging to her hand at night. But even the child sensed the heaviness that pressed upon the little household, and her once carefree play was tempered by the silence she saw in her father's eyes. The storm outside their doors did not come only from the officials who wanted land. Word of Evelina's choice had spread far beyond the village, reaching into the city's parlors and business halls. Richard Bennett, her father, never spoke her name publicly without venom, declaring that he had no daughter. Society echoed him with cruel amusement. To them, Evelina was a parable of folly, the golden girl who traded pearls for mud. Whenever she and Mark took their produce to the market, whispers followed her. Some pointed and shook their heads, others laughed aloud. A wealthy merchant's son, one of the suitors her father once praised, even called out across the market square one afternoon, sneering loudly enough for all to hear, "So this is what you gave it all up for? A beggar with cows and a patched roof? You could have been dining with lords, Evelina, and now you haul buckets with peasants." The insult stung, but Evelina lifted her head high. She remembered her father's cold words, the scorn she had faced at home, and found within herself the courage to answer clearly, her voice strong above the noise of the market. Better to live poor with a man of honor than rich with a coward who hides behind his father's name. Her words silenced the crowd for a moment, and though laughter soon resumed, there were also nods of respect from simpler folk who admired her defiance. Mark, who had kept his head bowed during the jeers, looked at her with something close to awe. But defiance alone could not feed them. nor could pride secure their home. The land dispute grew more pressing, and Mark, worn down by years of labor and disappointment, began to despair. Evelina found him late at night, staring into the dying fire, his hands clenched tightly, his jaw set in anguish. "They will take everything," he said in a voice hollow with defeat. "I cannot fight them. I am one man. Men like me were born to lose against men with money." Evelina knelt beside him, her own heart heavy, but her spirit unwilling to bend. "You are not one man anymore," she said. "You have me, you have Lila. We are not powerless, Mark. We can make this farm stronger. We can make it worth more than they can imagine. We will not let them drive us away." He shook his head. "You do not understand how this world works. Money buys power, and power decides who eats and who starves." But Evelina did understand. She had been raised in that world of money and power, and she knew how cruelly it ruled. Yet she also knew there were ways to resist it. In the days that followed, she began to act. While Mark labored in the fields, she traveled to the nearby town, carrying with her baskets of butter and cheese she had learned to make from their milk. She walked into shops, taverns, and even small restaurants, offering samples with polite confidence. Her beauty drew attention, but her determination earned respect. Slowly, she found buyers who valued the freshness of their produce. Her efforts multiplied. She studied books she still kept from her schooling, teaching herself how to record accounts, how to balance supplies, how to plan for profit. She convinced Mark to diversify the products they sold, experimenting with cream and yogurt, and she began packaging them carefully to appeal to townsfolk. At first, the income was meager, but it grew, and with it, a new hope took root in their hearts. Mark could not hide his amazement as he watched Evelina transform from the delicate daughter of a magnate into a farmer's partner who woke at dawn, bargained with merchants, and returned with coins clinking in her apron. In the midst of their struggles, life delivered another test. One evening, Lila fell ill. Her small body burned with fever, her breaths ragged, her eyes glazed with fear. Mark panicked, holding his daughter close, whispering her name as if the repetition might save her. But it was Evelina who remained calm. She brewed remedies from herbs gathered in the fields, bathed the girl's forehead with cool cloths, and stayed by her side through the long nights. Mark watched as Evelina soothed Lila with soft songs, stroked her hair, and whispered promises that everything would be well. For hours, Evelina did not leave the child's side, and when at last the fever broke, Lila clung to her with tears of relief, whispering, "Mama, don't leave me." At that moment, something within Mark shifted. The woman he had once believed too delicate for his world had become the anchor that held their family together. He looked at Evelina and saw not a stranger from another life, but the mother his daughter had lost, the partner he had thought he would never find again. Gratitude, love, and awe mingled in his eyes, and though he said little, Evelina saw all she needed in his expression. As the weeks wore on, Evelina's determination bore fruit. The farm began to prosper modestly, their name quietly spreading through the town as sellers of honest, high-quality goods. Yet their fragile peace was soon overshadowed by news from the city. Richard Bennett's empire, once unshakable, was crumbling. A business partner had betrayed him, investments had soured, and debts mounted. For the first time in decades, the mighty Bennett name trembled with weakness. Richard, desperate to salvage what he could, turned to suppliers and allies for help. And fate, with its cruel humor, ensured that one of the few reliable sources of produce in the region now came from the very farm he had scorned. When Evelina heard the rumors, she did not gloat. She felt only the tightening of the threads that bound her past to her present. Mark, too, heard the whispers and grew uneasy. "He will never ask me," he said bitterly. "A man like him would rather starve than take help from the one he despises." But Evelina knew her father better. Pride had always been his armor, but desperation had a way of breaking even the strongest walls. She sensed that soon, the man who had cast her out would come knocking on the door of the farm he had mocked. And when he did, the true test of their love and dignity would arrive. Night fell upon their small home, the sound of the cows settling in the barn, and the crickets singing in the fields filling the air. Evelina sat beside Mark by the fire, Lila asleep in her lap, her breathing even and soft. Mark stared into the flames, his face marked by lines of hardship and endurance. Evelina rested her hand on his, steady and certain. Together they had faced scorn, poverty, and sickness. Together they had begun to build something out of nothing. Yet they both knew the greatest trial still lay ahead, one that would pit their fragile happiness against the wrath and pride of her father's world. As the embers dimmed, Evelina whispered almost to herself, "Whatever comes, we will endure it. This love was not chosen lightly, and it will not be broken easily." Mark turned to her, his expression weary yet resolute, and nodded. Outside, the night deepened, carrying on its winds the distant rumblings of a storm that would soon reach their door. The storm Evelina had long since finally arrived with the weight of inevitability. It was not thunder or rain, but the sound of hooves and carriage wheels grinding to a halt at the edge of their small farm. Mark was in the barn forking hay to the cows when he heard the approach. Evelina stood near the doorway of the house, Lila tugging gently at her dress, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. The carriage that stopped before them bore the family crest she had once seen on every letterhead, every business document, every embroidered seat of her father's empire. For a moment her breath caught. She had known this day would come, yet the sight of that crest against the dust of their humble land filled her with dread. When Richard Bennett stepped down, time seemed to falter. He looked older than she remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his suit creased not with the dignity of wealth, but with the disarray of desperation. His face still held pride, but his eyes betrayed a man cornered by his own crumbling kingdom. Evelina had last seen him in fury, disowning her with words sharp enough to wound a lifetime. Now, standing at the gate of the very home he had once called disgraceful, he looked diminished. Mark emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, his posture wary but steady. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rustled the trees, a cow lowed in the distance, and Evelina felt her heart thudding in her chest. At last, her father broke the silence. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice rough as though the words scraped his throat on their way out. He looked not at Evelina, but at Mark. "You have what I need, supplies, consistency. I have contracts to fulfill and nowhere to turn. If you provide for me, perhaps we can come to an arrangement." Mark did not answer at once. He studied the older man carefully, the lines of power still etched across his face, though now they wavered with weakness. Evelina watched as Mark's jaw tightened, and she feared what his pride might make him say. Finally he spoke, his voice measured but unwavering. "I will provide because families depend on your business, not because I owe you. I will not let innocent people suffer for the pride of men who never cared for mine." Richard's gaze faltered, and for the first time Evelina saw her father's pride pierced. He shifted uneasily, clearly unused to being addressed with such quiet authority by a man he had once called nothing. Evelina stepped forward then, her hand slipping into Mark's. "This is the man I chose," she said softly. "The man you despised, and yet he stands now as your only hope." Richard's eyes moved from their joined hands to Evelina's face, and something flickered there. Pain, regret, perhaps even shame. He nodded stiffly, unable to answer. The days that followed proved Mark's promise true. His small farm, nurtured by Evelina's determination and hard work, became the lifeline for Richard's failing company. Deliveries of butter, milk, cheese, and cream filled wagons bound for the city, ensuring that contracts were met and reputations salvaged. Each time Richard saw the crates marked with Mark's hand, he was forced to confront the bitter truth. The man he had scorned was now the pillar holding up what remained of his empire. At first, Richard visited only to oversee the supplies, but gradually his reasons changed. He began to linger after business was concluded, standing awkwardly at the doorway while Lila tugged at Evelina's skirts and laughed with the cows in the yard. He watched the child cling to Evelina, calling her mama with trust and warmth, and his expression softened despite himself. One evening, he sat at their humble table, the rough wood far from the gleaming polish of his mansion. He ate bread and drank milk offered by Evelina, and for the first time in years he seemed human, rather than a statue carved by pride. It was Margaret, Evelina's mother, who finally came as well. She arrived with tears already in her eyes, her arms outstretched to her daughter, and Evelina fell into them with sobs that released years of strain. Margaret wept openly, stroking her hair, whispering apologies and prayers of thanks that she was safe. Richard stood apart, silent, until Evelina pulled Lila to her side and said softly, "This is your granddaughter." The child hid shyly at first, but when Richard knelt to her level, offering his hand, Lila placed hers in his without hesitation. In that moment, something within him broke. The wall he had built between himself and the life his daughter had chosen crumbled. He whispered, "I was blind. Forgive me." Mark, ever steady, did not gloat. He offered no reproach. Instead, he extended his hand, and Richard took it. Their handshake was not only a truce, but a recognition that dignity lived not in wealth, but in character. Evelina's eyes filled with tears as she watched, knowing that this was the moment she had prayed for, the reconciliation of the two worlds she straddled. It was agreed then that Evelina and Mark would marry properly, not in secrecy or defiance, but with the blessing of her parents. Preparations were simple, for neither wealth nor grandeur mattered to them. The church in the village was adorned with wildflowers gathered by neighbors, the pews filled with townsfolk who had once mocked but now admired their perseverance. Margaret arrived in elegant attire, tears shining in her eyes, while Richard entered quietly, no longer the man who commanded rooms, but a father humbled by the lessons of loss and love. On the day of the wedding, Evelina walked down the aisle not in jewels or silks, but in a dress sewn by local hands, simple yet radiant. Lila skipped beside her, carrying a bouquet almost too large for her small arms, her smile brighter than any lamp. When Evelina reached Mark, his eyes brimmed with emotion, his hands steady as they took hers. The vows they exchanged were not grand speeches, but promises woven with truth. To endure hardship, to cherish each other, to raise Layla together as their bond of love. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the church filled with applause and cheers, laughter echoing off the wooden beams. Richard, standing near the front, wiped his eyes discreetly, while Margaret openly sobbed with joy. For once, there was no division of wealth or class, no scorn or pride, only the celebration of two people who had chosen each other against all odds. The reception that followed was held in the open air, tables lined with simple dishes, bread, cheese, milk, and roasted meats provided by neighbors. Music played, children danced in the grass, and laughter carried into the night. Mark held Evelina close as they swayed beneath the stars, and Lila clutched their hands, unwilling to let go. At the edge of the gathering, Richard lifted his glass and spoke words no one had expected to hear. "I was a fool," he said, his voice unsteady but clear. "I measured worth by gold and names, but today I see that true wealth is here, in love and in family. I am proud of my daughter, proud of the man she has chosen, and grateful for the granddaughter who has given me back my heart." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Evelina pressed her face into Mark's chest, overwhelmed with emotion. As the night deepened and the stars brightened above them, Evelina, Mark, and Lila sat together on the steps of their modest home. The sounds of celebration still echoed faintly in the distance. But here, in the quiet, there was peace. Lila leaned against Evelina, her eyes fluttering shut with exhaustion, while Mark's arm wrapped protectively around them both. Evelina looked at the horizon, painted silver by moonlight, and felt a calm she had never known. She thought of the mansion she had left behind, the wealth she had forsaken, the pride she had defied. None of it mattered now. What mattered was this: love hard-earned, family forged in struggle, and the knowledge that happiness could bloom even in the humblest soil. In the stillness of that moment, Evelina whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "This is home." Mark heard her and kissed the top of her head, his silence answering louder than words. And so their story, once marked by defiance and hardship, closed not with regret, but with reconciliation, not with wealth, but with something richer. The simple, unbreakable truth of love. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our next video for another powerful journey and explore our other videos for more stories like this. And please, share this one with someone who needs to hear it.